So, welcome to our Beyond Awareness Action and Prevention series in honor of Sexual Awareness and Sexual Violence Prevention Months during April and May. If you missed our session 1 last week that was on consent, we highly recommend you check it out on our YouTube page, and Natalie will add the link into our chat. Consent is one of the foundations in this series, and our topic for today is boundaries, which is obviously rooted and founded within consent. So boundaries, what are they? And how do we establish them? How do we establish them? And what types of boundaries do we have? And so while we wait for people to trickle in, you can message myself, Kylee, or Natalie with any tech issues. And again, introduce yourself in the chat if you wish, or let us know where you're joining from. So I'm just going to continue on. My name is Kylee. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Sexual Violence Prevention Coordinator at Amelia Rising. You can learn more about us by visiting our website at ameliarising.ca. This is Natalie. She is my coworker. Natalie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, thanks, Kylee. As she said, I'm Natalie Austin. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a sexual violence prevention educator at Amelia Rising.
Thank you. And so at Amelia Rising, if you're not already familiar with our services, we do offer tools, including counseling, education, and advocacy to help people ages 12 and up to have healthier, safer relationships. Amelia Rising offers free counseling for people who did not have their consent respected. And if you'd like more information on our services, you can find us on social media or again on our website. And you can feel free to email us or send us a message on social media to connect with someone on our team. Amelia Rising in North Bay rests on the traditional Anishinaabe territory of Nipissing and Dokis First Nation. And this territory is covered by the Robinson, Huron, and Upper Canada treaties. We are putting a website in the chat and invite you to view what traditional lands and treaty you are on and what this means for you in your fight against sexual violence and gender-based violence. So again, you can visit nativeland.ca to view what treaty and territory you are currently on if you're outside of the Nipissing, North Bay, Nipissing and Doki First Nation area. I personally feel that I can't talk about violence and violence prevention without acknowledging that violence has been continually committed against the land and Indigenous people, especially Indigenous women and girls, through the abuses of state power, colonial rule, and settler violence resulting in intergenerational trauma and harm. So I do want to put a resource in the chat if anyone is interested in learning more about human trafficking trends in Canada in relation to Indigenous populations and women and girls within Canada. So 90% of sex trafficking survivors in Canada are women and girls, and 50% of those trafficked girls and 51% of those are trafficked women were Indigenous. We want to recognize that these conversations can have negative activators, and we would like to share a resource in the chat that has free phone and counseling options available 24/7 for Canadians, Indigenous Canadians. And this resource is called Hope for Wellness. It offers chat and phone counseling in several different languages. Natalie, can you just take over for a quick second?
Yep. There's another resource that we want to put in the chat. If you would like to learn more about supporting Indigenous women and girls, created by the Native Women's Association of Canada. I'm just going to put it in right now. There's another resource called the Land Body Defense that Kylee can maybe elaborate on more right now that we're putting in the chat.
Thank you. Sorry about that, folks. Yeah, so the Violence on the Land, Violence on Our Body, created by landbodydefense.org, is an initiative and collaboration project in regards to acknowledging the fact that violence has been occurring on this land for centuries, and how can we even think about respecting each other as human beings when we can't even respect the land that we inhabit. And this piece really does talk about how violence and trauma on land, especially within Indigenous culture, directly relates to violence and trauma within ourselves and across people, and within system power as well. So I won't spend too much more time on this piece. I will introduce it every session and have a different spin or take on it depending on how it's going today. So I do encourage you to reflect and look at this piece and information and website resource on your own time, because there are other pieces of art in regards to this that really speak to me personally. Anyways, so we will continue on, and I hope you had some time to reflect and reflect on this image and what it means to you, and if anything stands out to yourself or stands out to you. And so, as we mentioned before, we would like to have some participation at the end of this session. So you can join us at slido.com and use the participant code 484354 to join us. You can also use a mobile device to scan the QR code if you're joining from a computer. And if you're joining from a mobile device, you can click the link in the chat or open up slido.com at a later time when we are ready to do the quiz at the end. And if you have any questions, you can also submit them in the chat or the Zoom Q&A, or use Slido, whichever you're most comfortable and prefer to use. So thank you for sitting with us through the introduction of Slido. And Natalie will continue on to summarize our overall goals of the workshop and moving on to the agenda of what you can expect.
Thanks, Kylie. So today we're hoping to just grow and expand our knowledge and understanding of boundaries. I don't know about you, but I did not really learn about boundaries growing up. And it was something that I had to learn on my own as an adult. Understanding also why boundaries are important and how to set them with ourselves and others, and to really increase our confidence with navigating boundaries to create safer relationships and more secure relationships. So now I will move on to the agenda. And so we're going to start with, what are boundaries? How are they defined? Different types of boundaries. We're going to watch a video after that. And then we're going to talk about how we can communicate our boundaries with different communication styles, how we can establish them, and what boundary violations look like, followed by a quick grounding activity at the end. So we can get right into it. So how are boundaries defined? There's 3 different types, and the first one is rigid, which is that nothing ever gets through this boundary. And, you know, these are firm, nothing gets through, and sometimes this is for safety reasons or due to past experiences or fears. And I will pass it over to Kylie to go through flexible and permeable.
Thank you, Natalie. So as Natalie talked about, we have rigid boundaries, and then we have flexible boundaries. So flexible essentially means that we are willing to be flexible with these boundaries depending on the context. And so again, this differs for everyone depending on the boundary, the circumstance, the person, the situation, and on so many different factors as to what our boundaries are and how flexible they may be or may not be. And permeable is where we have little to no boundary and almost everything gets through. And we'll expand on these a little bit later on, but essentially that is the condensed version. And so we have different flexibilities to define and assert our boundaries or not assert them if we don't have rigid boundaries on something. And we can have different flexibility definitions with different types of boundaries. So for example, we have 7 types of boundaries, and we may be rigid, flexible, or permeable on any or all of them. And that may change depending again on the context. So we will move on to cover the 7 types of boundaries. So our 7 types of boundaries are physical, emotional, time, sexual, intellectual, material, and spiritual. And we will review each definition, and we'd like you to think about how rigid, flexible, or permeable some of your boundaries might be in these certain types of boundaries. And again, if you have any questions about what rigid, permeable, or flexible means, you can put them in the chat or the Q&A. We will chat a little bit more about them, but I'm hoping they make sense, and we will use examples of them throughout the session. So first and foremost is our physical boundaries. So our physical boundaries are anything that involves physical touch or movement. So this can include hugs, handshakes, touching a disability aid, or having physical space boundaries, such as your bedroom or your wallet. And we will also talk more about some other boundaries that kind of intersect and intercross. But for now, physical boundaries are pretty standard in regards to any physical touching or movement or space physically around us. And again, physical boundaries can change depending on the person and circumstance. My physical boundary for contact might differ if I'm in a kickboxing class versus walking down the street and hanging out with my friends, right? Different kinds of boundaries in different types of circumstances. So Natalie, do you want to continue on for emotional? Or is there anything else you want to add?
Oh, so folks can feel free to sort of look at these questions that are on the slide, and sort of like reflect on them, on what their physical boundaries are. About like, do you like people to hug you? Do you want handshakes, high fives? Like who, by who, friends, family, coworkers, like which boundaries might you have for different people? And if you can get this slide if you ask for the slides after the session. But for now, we can definitely move on to emotional.
Yes, thank you, Natalie, for expanding. I meant to mention that the question, like, we can't tell you what your physical boundaries are or not, and that's going to be the theme for all of the boundaries. We can't tell you what they are, but we can provide you a general description and then provide you with some questions to ask yourself to help you define what your boundaries may or may not look like.
Yeah. And so with emotional boundaries, it's, how we process and who we choose to confide in emotionally. And this can look like asking ourselves who we feel safe with, who we don't. How can we check in to make sure our trusted person is able to support our emotions? So part of emotional boundaries could be always making sure to ask somebody if they have the capacity to listen to you. And that could be, like a boundary you can have with yourself. I know sometimes it's not always easy to remember to do that. But it's one of the ways we can establish to check in with each other, to ensure who's comfortable and knowing at, any time that we can say, hey, I need 5, minutes to take some space, but maybe I can listen to you then, or I can't listen to you now. So depending on different relationships with family or friends, you may or may not be comfortable or feel safe, sharing these things. And so that's where it becomes, is this flexible? Is it permeable? And, sometimes you might have a more rigid or guarded approach. Some people don't like to share emotionally, and those are some really rigid boundaries that they have. So looking at some of the questions here, it sort of goes through like what I said, and so really just, Kylee, do you have anything to add?
I think so. In regards to all of these boundaries, they go both ways. So not only are we discussing how we can reflect and express our emotional boundaries and physical boundaries and needs for what we need or don't want from other people, but also in relation to when we're recognizing other people asserting some of these boundaries or communicating some of these boundaries if they're not able to chat. If you are asking someone to talk for 5 minutes and they don't have the time, there's obviously or they don't have the emotional capacity, sorry, to have that conversation at the time. That is obviously an important thing to consider on both ends, right? And as Natalie said, asking ourselves what we feel comfortable sharing and with who is an emotional boundary that we may have. And so that's how a boundary might be flexible, right? Changing in between persons. Some of us might not open up to anyone, and that could be, like Natalie said, a very rigid boundary. And so moving on to emotional, we have a time boundary. So again, with that example, with the meeting 5 minutes to take some space, not only do you need maybe 5 minutes to take space because emotionally you're not ready for that conversation, but also just the time. Maybe you just don't have the time for that conversation and it has nothing to do with emotion. So the time you allot yourself and others who are willing to, a time boundary is anything when you allot yourself to others and who you are willing to give your time to. So this can mean personally or professionally, and it is about knowing the value of your time. We are starting to recognize in more recent years, or even me, myself personally, that just because someone has free time, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're available to spend it with us, or it doesn't necessarily mean that just because they have free time, they don't have something scheduled, doesn't mean that they have to schedule something in place of that. And that free time might be reserved for themselves, and that might be time to take rest or to recharge. And plans with ourselves or with yourself are still plans. You don't have to have plans with someone or doing something for it to be a valid plan. Your time is your own. And so if you have any other examples of time boundaries or even emotional or physical boundaries, you can add them into the chat or the Q&A. If you have any questions as to would this be considered a XYZ boundary, go for it. You can put it in the chat. And so with our time boundaries, we really want to check in with how much time would we like to reserve for certain people, or even including ourselves, how much time are we reserving for ourselves, and what's taking up priority and how we divide up our time, and how do we value our time and decide who gets extra time with who gets extra time. Are we going to devote extra time to our boss or a coworker this week, or do we need to devote more time to maybe a community connection or a client, or perhaps family and friends are taking a precedent this week in regards to a long weekend coming up or anything like that. And so with that being said, Natalie, if you don't have anything to add, or if there's nothing in the chat, I can move on to the next boundary.
Yep, I can move on to sexual boundaries. So our sexual boundaries range from intimacy to sexual touch, sexual or intimate feelings, conversations, preferences, likes, dislikes, sexual health boundaries, including reproductive health. Like, for example, if you have a boundary that you absolutely, will not do anything with someone unless you have been appropriately tested, then that's a boundary. And to identify our sexual boundaries, we might ask ourselves, how you communicate consent, and how do you communicate it? Do you communicate it verbally, non-verbally? How does your sexual partner communicate consent? How do I like to communicate when you are sexually intimate? Do you use body language? Are you mainly verbal, a mixture of both? And what are your limits regarding sexual safety? Talking about sex and intimacy can be a sexual boundary as well. Not everyone is this comfortable, and also deciding on what contraception is necessary can be a sexual boundary. So are you using condoms? Are you using the pill, IUD? Again, yes, do you prefer to get tested for STIs, and how will you manage your STI health and safety? So unless Kylee has anything else to say, we can move on to intellectual boundaries.
No, I think sexual boundaries is pretty, I don't want to say pretty standard. Some of them, it varies, but if you have any questions or comments, and you can put them in the chat, and you can also do anonymous questions or comments as well. And so again, our sexual boundaries are essentially, they go hand in hand with sexual touching or sexual conversation, sharing of photos and imagery, consenting to watching or participating or taking any like videos or photos or anything like that. Those are all considered sexual boundaries, and including sexting and things like that as well. So we all have different types of boundaries in regards to what that looks like. And so moving on to our intellectual boundaries. So these can range from how we protect ourselves from ideas and perspectives that harm or diminish our other boundaries, such as emotional. So for example, if someone is presenting you with something and you're asking yourself, does this idea or perspective cause me emotional distress or excitement? Because it might be infringing on a time boundary. If it's causing you, or it might be infringing on an intellectual boundary if it is causing you distress, right? Versus excitement, that might be a boundary that might be something that you're more willing to open up to in regards to that conversation. And again, your time. Is this conversation, or is this is this worth my time? If it's causing me emotional distress, is it really worth my time? If it's causing me excitement, maybe it is worth my time. And to identify our intellectual boundaries, you might ask yourselves, who am I willing to engage in intellectual discussions with? What perspectives am I willing to hear? Am I open to all perspectives? And acknowledging that maybe we're not always open to all the perspectives, and maybe that's also okay. And so over the past couple of years, I think we have all come to know what perspectives and ideas do not align with our values. And so when we are having conversations and reflecting on our perspectives, ideas, we do want to always check in with ourselves and how we're feeling about if they align with our values. So there are some questions here about what kinds of behavior that will let us know if our ideas or perspectives or values are not being heard, or maybe they're being diminished. So Natalie, do you want to expand on this and take it away?
So I have a story about like an intellectual boundary that I had to draw because I have a friend of the family who is really interested in politics, and he knows that I'm a politically like minded person, and he knows that he can engage me in a conversation about politics if he brings it up. But I eventually had to stop having these conversations with him, or engaging in these conversations with him, because I could tell that he wasn't really interested in having a conversation. He was just more interested in trying to convince me over to what he thought. And he didn't really care about what I had to say. He didn't really care about like my thoughts or my values or what I had going on. He just really wanted to tell me like why I was wrong and why I should like think the way that he did. And so I really had to just stop engaging in those conversations after a while, because it just became clear to me that it was just the same conversation over and over again. And he wasn't really willing to absorb any new information than what he already had going on. So that's sort of like my example of setting an intellectual boundary with somebody. And I think that, if someone else has an example, they can put it like anonymously in the Q&A on Slido, or they can put it anonymously in the Q&A on Zoom, or even in the chat if you just feel comfortable putting it there. But in the meantime, I'm going to move on to material boundaries. And so material boundaries are things like your house, your car, your clothes, your money, or your finances. You can feel free to also put some other examples in the chat if you think of them. So the questions here are kind of more, it's what can you afford to share? What can you afford to share? What are you willing to share? How will you share what you have? Who will you share with? And, what aren't you going to share? What can't you? So for example, if someone needs a ride somewhere, how often are you willing to give that or do that for them? This can also be a time boundary, because it's your time spent giving that person a ride. It can be financial, because who's paying for gas and upkeep of the car? Are you just willing to let them borrow your car? Is that, a level of trust you have? if someone comes to stay at your house, for how long, what are they like, what are you willing to let them, what can you afford to let them use at your house, someone borrowing your clothes. There's a lot of different questions that can be asked about material boundaries, and it's really just, mostly like what you can afford and what you're willing to share with folks and what you're not.
Thank you, Natalie. So for material boundaries, I try. So sometimes when I look at material boundaries and I ask myself about what can I afford to share, I do, like, it's not about being cheap or anything like that. It's also just about, like, honestly, financially not being able to afford to split a pizza sometimes, and being able to not just you're drawing that boundary with yourself and with your friends, and but material boundaries, as Natalie alluded to, that everything can kind of cross over. So sometimes our time also affects a boundary, or our emotional boundary might affect our material boundary. Letting someone borrow a car or stay with you at the home, like, all of these boundaries can be flexible, depending on the circumstance, or sometimes they might be rigid. Doesn't matter who it is. For example, I think of this toothbrush example. This is always, for me, is because it always astonishes me how many people actually share their toothbrush with others. And to me, I think that's absolutely disgusting. And that's a material object that I'm just absolutely not willing to share under any circumstances with anyone. That's a very rigid material boundary. And I feel like material, it doesn't have to be something as big as finances or a house or a car. It can be something small like a toothbrush. And so just keeping that in mind as well. And so for our last boundary, we like to talk about spiritual boundaries. So spiritual beliefs do vary from person to person, and they cannot be defined in a nice sentence wrapped with a bow. But our spiritual boundaries can range from religious to being faith-based, universe-based, whichever we choose to believe in. And so to identify our spiritual boundaries, we might ask ourselves, could I marry someone outside of my practicing religion or beliefs? Is my religion or beliefs, etc., being taken away from me? Do I feel like they're being diminished, violated, or weaponized against me? And so examples can include spiritual abusive boundaries can include the Holocaust in residential schools. I use that term very lightly. Cults utilize spiritual boundaries and prey on people's spiritual beliefs and needs. So that's another example of spiritual beliefs and boundaries being weaponized. And so not that spiritual boundaries, I'm using these examples because we don't often think of spiritual boundaries. I feel like this is something that isn't often discussed. And so when we put it into context in this way, some folks can start to see where spiritual boundaries might come into play in their own personal lives. I personally don't practice that or follow a religion, but I do have spiritual beliefs and boundaries outside of that. Natalie, do you want to elaborate on spiritual boundaries or have any other examples, personal or otherwise?
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought up, like, on a bigger scale, like Holocaust and residential schools, because those are, like, things that were violated for folks, for centuries and centuries, and still are. But a more recent example I saw in the media is actually from the show Love is Blind. And so a woman, like, she would not be with a man because he did not share her same religion. And even though, like, he was atheist, she was Christian, and he didn't think it was a big deal. But she said that, like, she could not marry somebody that was not also, like, Christian. And when I heard her say that, I personally, I didn't understand. I didn't agree. But that's the thing about it, is that I didn't have to. It was her boundary. She said it. And that was, I was also kind of impressed that she was able to say, like, this is a boundary for me and I'm sticking to it. And so it seemed pretty rigid for her. And that's the one example that I do have recently. Also giving away that I watched Love is Blind. So enjoy.
No shame, no shame. I am noticing some questions in the chat, which is awesome. We can type and answer them, but we'll discuss them conversationally later, because they're awesome questions and we want to talk about them and bring that into the video. So thank you for asking. Just continue to throw them in and throw in all your thoughts as they come in through the conversation, because we don't want you to forget them. So having said that, Natalie, do you want to move on to the next section?
Sure. So I know we kind of talked a little fast, and so if you just needed something to recap all the different boundaries, we do have this video that we're also going to put in the chat. It goes over the 7 different kinds of boundaries, and it's based off a book that we actually will be referencing a lot in the next section. Called Unf Your Boundaries. It's not the actual word, as you can see by the video, but it's by an excellent author named Faith G. Harper, Dr. Faith G. Harper. And we're just going to play it now so you can get sort of the recap of everything we just said.
My friend Anna Laura actually recently recommended the book Unfuck Your Boundaries, Build Better Relationships Through Consent, Communication, and by Expressing Your Needs by Faith G. Harper. And it was revelatory. Hallelujah, baby. Let's dive right in. There are 7 types of boundaries. 1, physical. Don't touch me. 2, property. Don't touch my stuff. 3, sexual. Don't touch me or my stuff. And sexual can also include the language and ideas around sexuality, for instance, how someone decides to talk to you about sex. 4, emotional relational boundaries, which we respect by how we care for others and by making space for them to have their own emotional experiences. 5, intellectual boundaries, your thoughts, beliefs, ideas, and how they are respected. 6, spiritual, your belief systems. And finally, 7, time boundaries, demands made on you or that you make on others involving time. Every boundary also has 3 versions. Rigid, where nothing gets through that boundary ever. Permeable, where everything can get through that boundary all the time. And finally, flexible, which of course is the ideal boundary because it comes from us listening to our internal voice, the one that wants to both protect us and have us experience growth. The book asks you to really examine how boundaries were first demonstrated and modeled for you. So where did your boundaries actually come from? As a kid, I often got the message that I should have permeable physical boundaries. Give your aunt a hug. And I can definitely see me reenacting these dynamics with my own kids. Kiss me on your lips. Kiss me. Kiss me on your lips. After figuring out the origin of your boundaries, Harper asks us to really examine how we respect those belonging to other people. So this requires you to really think about some times that you have possibly violated somebody else's boundaries. Like, you know, when I violate my brother's intellectual ones. Yeah, everything you think is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I didn't even finish talking. You didn't need to. And I have definitely not respected some emotional relational boundaries back in my youth. Dude, you're overreacting, okay? Whatever happened doesn't justify this reaction. But the book is an excellent way to really look at our relationships to boundaries and get a more comprehensive understanding of where they came from, if they're working, and how to build better ones. Harper's final nugget of knowledge is to ask us to get clear on our values and then create boundaries around them. So if your value is honesty, make a boundary. Babe, did this just make me look fat? Yes. Thank you so much for respecting my white lie boundary, babe. No problem, babe. Learning how to honor the boundaries of others and ourselves will lead to healthier relationships, better interpersonal communication, and more fulfillment. I'm Anna Akana, and thank you so much to Audible for sponsoring today's video. Audible helps you get more stories and information through the gift of found time.
So yeah, we really love that video because it just sort of sums everything up in a really great way. And now we are going to move on to talk about how boundaries are communicated. And we really like this quote from Dr. Faith G. Harper. Communication is how we do boundaries and consent. And, you know, if you were here last week for the consent session, you might remember that we said that communication was just an overarching theme throughout all the session topics. And here we see it as a foundation for how we can communicate our boundaries. And why is this important? Because And this is another quote from Faith G. Harper, and she says, understanding our language patterns and making active changes in them will create better ways to negotiate the world and better ways to recognize, uphold, and communicate boundaries. So next, we are going to review the 4 main communication styles we might use in different situations and contexts.
Thanks, Natalie. As you can see, we absolutely love Dr. Faith G. Harper. We encourage you to check out her website and her books. She also has some youth and kid-friendly books and content as well. The first communication style that I'd like to chat about is passive. And so sometimes passive is a response that we have when we don't feel safe or comfortable or confident in expressing feelings, wants, or needs. And this results in the person keeping thoughts to themselves as a form of protection. And sometimes passive communicators were just not given the tools to speak up for themselves, or they weren't in an environment that allowed them to. And so passive communication can also be used in situations where someone might identify themselves as having a social anxiety disorder. And so with that being said, we do want to, say that we may fluctuate between these communication styles. We might change between them depending on who we're with. We might notice them depending on who we're with, and not everyone, it's very unlikely that you'll find someone who is in a one communication style at all times. We often do switch it up. And so with that, Natalie will move on to aggressive communication styles.
Thanks, Kylie. Yeah, so aggressive, contrary to what people might believe, is not always about a physical response. Aggressive communication is a way that dominates or violates the rights of others. And that does, so you don't always need to be physically aggressive in order to achieve that. So domination can be presented by making oneself appear larger or overbearing. So I guess that is physical, but it's also yelling, by insulting, belittling, or abusing another, whether it's verbally, psychologically, physically, or sexually. And aggressive communicators often use you statements, like you did this because you are that. And so, I'm sure we've all been an aggressive communicator at some point in our life. And I'm sure we've all encountered an aggressive communicator at some point in our life. And so I will actually pass it back off to Kylie, who will talk about passive aggressive communication.
Thanks, Natalie. And yeah, as Natalie said, we ourselves can fluctuate between these communication styles. And it's not that, and sometimes we need to have a more aggressive communication style in certain contexts if we need to be, well, I want to say firm, but I guess that's more, we'll get to that later. But I just want to say that aggressive communication styles we might, exhibit at some point in our lives. And it's not that it's always physically violent, like Natalie said. And so again, I would love to see examples of any of these communication styles that we might be using or have witnessed others use in the media or personally. You can add them in the comments as well or in the chat. And so passive aggressive communication style, as you can probably imagine, is a combination of both passive and aggressive. So this communication style is often seen and even popularized in the media, such as comedies or dramas. So for example, you might see in a comedy show someone commenting that someone isn't doing the dishes, and then there's a laugh track, instead of addressing this person calmly and directly and saying, hey, roommate, I noticed the dishes aren't being done. It makes me feel like you don't really respect when I clean. I'd really appreciate it if you could just pick up after yourself. And so that, is taking an example of turning something, being passive and just brushing something off, but also acknowledging it in a way that isn't direct. And so it gives the other person a mixed communication signal because your actions and your words aren't always lining up. And so passive aggressive communication, like I said, is very popularized in the media, but also I feel like we use it a lot and don't even notice it. For example, leaving a passive aggressive sticky note for a coworker, like, would be really nice if someone cleaned the coffee pot sometimes, smiley face. That's a passive aggressive way of saying, hey, clean the coffee pot because it's gross. And let's respect each other. So passive aggressive, again, depends on the circumstance and situation as to when we might display these communication styles. And I'll give it to Natalie to finish it off with assertive, which I apologize, I kind of got ahead of myself and confused earlier, but go ahead, Natalie.
So Kylee kind of sort of gave us a good example of what assertive communication is. So passive aggressive communication would be someone leaving that sort of like that note that Kylee talked about. It would be great if someone cleaned the coffee pot, but being assertive communicator means that you're able to assert your feelings, wants, and needs appropriately, respectfully, and directly. Just like having flexible boundaries is the more ideal boundary style. Assertive communication is the sort of like ideal communication style that is better, because then you can say, hey, like, can you clean the coffee pot because it is disgusting? And that would be an assertive response. Like, let's respect our space, let's respect each other. It's ideal, but not always accessible or safe to use. So that is the main thing. It depends on the context and the relationship or situation you're in. Because the one thing about passive or passive aggressive forms of communication, or even aggressive forms of communication, is that they can't protect us. Assertive is an ideal. So, or maybe if we're shy, have anxiety, are neurodivergent, it may not be the best way for us to communicate, but it sort of is one of the better ways to be able to establish our boundaries with folks, is to sort of just assertively say what we want, what we need. It is more clear, and it, can help build self-trust, and it can help others build trust in you. But again, if this, we're not all in one, like Kylee said, we're not all in one communication style all the time, and different situations may call for different styles. So unless Kylee has more to add, we can move on to
Yeah, there's nothing else to add. I just want to say that I thank you again for putting ideas and comments into the chat and question. Absolutely, you're providing really good examples, and we will expand on those at the end, because someone asked about snarky comments being passive aggressive, and the short answer is yes, most likely, depending on the context. But again, everything's a little different. But yeah, assertive, like Natalie says, the ideal, but we can't always be in the ideal all the time, right? So just reflecting and acknowledging and moving forward. And with moving forward, we have some tips and things that we can try to help better communicate boundaries. So go ahead, Natalie.
Yes. So for establishing boundaries, like you might be wondering, how do you actually do this? You're telling me I need to do this. How can we actually do it? And while there's no answer that will work for everybody, there are some common suggestions for like what establishing a boundary looks like. So first, figure out what you're comfortable with and what makes you feel safe and why, what your values are. And once you've figured this out and what your boundary is, let others know, state your boundary. So in the example from the video that we watched, that person had a boundary around people not saying white lies because she really wanted to know what they thought. And the third part is to decide what happens if someone crosses your boundary, and how you will commit to maintaining that boundary. And so this may depend on how many times is the boundary being crossed, on whether it's rigid or flexible or permeable. So it's like, if someone crosses your boundary once, it could be a mistake. And so you could just say, hey, like, I have a boundary around this. I would prefer if you, didn't do that. And that person might be like, oh, sorry, like won't happen again. But if it's something that happens twice or even more, then you might have to decide what happens if somebody like repeatedly is crossing that boundaries. And so it might be a more assertive action, or, you know, it may be a total sort of like 3 strikes you're out type situation. And so again, if someone crosses your boundary, you can be assertive and let your actions speak louder than your words. And, you know, how do we want to do we want to push this connection further away or pull ones closer and be better? So it's sort of you having to decide like how you will maintain your boundary, how you will enforce it, depending on the relationship you're in and the context of the situation. Figuring out how you want to maintain boundaries and maintaining it. So, and like I said before, maintaining your own boundaries that you have set with yourself or with others can help build self-trust because you are showing you that you will do what you say. We can't control what others will do, but we can control what we do. And so like Kylee, I think, put this in the chat. This cartoon we love because it gives a lot of good examples of healthy boundaries in relationships. Feel free to screenshot it or visit the Instagram. And next, on the next slide, we'll look at a sentence structure by Dr. Faith G. Harper to help us express our feelings and our needs and to reestablish what our boundaries are. So she has the quote that I think I read out loud before, but it's, I feel when you and what I want is, and I will let Kylee go over that.
Thanks, Natalie. And so with that being said, it's not that you have to use those exact words as they are written, but essentially the idea of the sentence structure is to just help us express the way we're feeling because we are entitled and our feelings are, we're entitled to having our own feelings and no one can tell us otherwise, and our feelings are valid. So starting with our feelings and using an I statement can help start a conversation instead of starting a conversation with you did this and you messed up and you. Using the I statement in regards to I feel, someone can't tell us how we feel. And so expressing why we feel that way, maybe like I feel this way when this happens. And then expressing, we can't always ask the other person to read our mind. We don't want to use that passive aggressive read my mind to read between the lines kind of conversation. So tell the other person what you'd like instead, or what a solution might look like. We don't have to have all the answers, but even if it's like, I didn't enjoy that joke, what I'd like instead maybe is you to not use that joke around me. And so we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And again, just understanding how our language can be used to communicate our boundaries and also understand other people's boundaries as well. And again, it also depends how safe you're feeling with having this conversation with the other person, as we do want to be, acknowledged that intimate partner and domestic violence and other forms of violence can exist if someone does try to voice concerns within a relationship. And for those reasons, someone might result in being a more passive communicator, again, due to safety reasons. And so that is a whole other conversation. And if that is more of a situation that you are navigating, please contact us or use our helpline or chat or victim services for safety planning. And so again, these are just guidelines. And if you are struggling to have some communication regarding boundaries that need to be respected within a relationship, physically or sexually, and or financially, emotionally, anything like that, again, you can reach out to us or the helpline for support and questions. And so I do want to again move on to the fact on expanding on the fact that this sentence structure, like I said, can be used depending on the situation and changed. So again, for example, the joke that I referred to, if someone makes a joke that you're not okay with, you could always say something like, I feel uncomfortable when you made that joke just now. So you're expressing that you felt the way you feel, and you're saying why, like what happened to make you feel that way. And this person has decided to add in additional information. So they're saying, I know you just meant it to be funny, and I thought I would laugh, and you thought I would laugh rather than be upset, but I struggle with jokes about that topic, but I'd really appreciate it if you didn't tell those jokes around me. And so adding that last sentence about saying, I'd appreciate if you didn't tell those jokes around me, lets the other person know how to move forward instead of leaving it at, but I struggle with jokes about that topic. Because if you left it there, the other person's like, okay, so what, I can't make jokes anymore? Is that what you're telling me? And I was like, no, you can tell that joke somewhere else to someone who might find it funny, or elaborate on why that joke's, not funny to you. Like, you can have a conversation about it, but at least this way you are, stating what you would like, and you're asserting that boundary. And with that being said, we do want to move forward with some boundary violations and what to do when someone isn't respecting a boundary and kind of what that looks like. And I just want to offer a content warning or trigger warning that this conversation might spark awareness of a time that you had a boundary violated, or perhaps a realization of violating someone else's boundaries might occur. So we're not all perfect. We might be sitting here going, oh dear, I have not, I got violated my mother or parents like time boundary, or maybe I violated someone's emotional boundary or something like that. So when we're having these conversations, it can be, it might just spark some hard emotions. So again, please feel free to use the chat and resource lines at the bottom if you do need support. So during the Handling No workshop later in the series, we will look at how to make an apology. We will look at the apology template, but we don't have the capacity to do that in today's workshop. So we do encourage you to join us in the future for the Handling No workshop. And so with that being said, when we're talking about boundary violations, it's essentially, there's different ways to look at a boundary violation, whether it is, it's essentially anything that happens with an act without consent, regardless, or depending, whether it's a physical boundary, sexual boundary, time boundary, emotional boundary, spiritual, material. Any boundary violation happens when there is an act without consent. And so boundary violations can be split into external and internal. And so we might already be familiar with and aware of what external and internal boundary violations are and what they look like. But just to end the workshop off, we'd like to quickly review these two violation categories. So external violations occur when anything outside of our mind is violated. And this can be our physical space, our physical body, whether it's sexually or physically. Can be like pushing or touching, or someone being too close to, for comfort. For example, this whole entire pandemic, the physical boundaries or external boundary violations with people, standing too close to me or breathing down my neck, or anything like that. Those are physical boundaries that I really had to navigate, like external boundaries that I really had to navigate more often than I had thought about before. And so material boundaries are external boundaries that can be violated. For example, if someone asks to borrow your favorite sweater for a day and then they never give it back, that might be a material boundary violation. And it's also, it would go into like an external example of a boundary violation. And time is an interesting boundary, because it can be both violated externally and internally, because time itself is not physical. It's not a physical object or a person, but it can still be violated with physical consequences, such as being late for an appointment or a meeting or work, wasting gas in a car ride as a favor, or not showing up to plans can be a violation, right? And so our time is valuable, and someone violating our time is a boundary that we can have both internal and external effects. And violations of emotional and spiritual boundaries can often result in manipulation or coercive control, which we'll talk about more at a later date. But our internal boundary violations, again, are anything that isn't physical, so mainly emotional, time, and spiritual. So having our emotional needs not being met or respected, or being abused, manipulated, again, our spiritual beliefs or ideas being manipulated. The use of coercive control is an emotional abuse, and that's an internal boundary violation. we will expand more on that a little bit later, but Natalie, do you have anything to add before we go into our little quiz there in Slido?
No, I think that you got it all. And we can do the quiz.
So if you're able to join us at slido.com with the code 484354 or scan the QR code if you have a mobile device, or you can click the link directly in the chat if you're on a mobile device or computer, and it'll just take you exactly to where you need to go. And I will bring it up in just a second. It's going to ask you to put in a name when we start the quiz. And so just be mindful that we want this to be private. So please do not put your real name. You can put in a letter, a phrase, like a random, your favorite color, a random object that you see around you. It doesn't matter, whatever alias name you want to use, you can do that for the quiz once we launch it. And so with that being said, I will pull that up. And after we go over our quiz, we will chat about some of those Q&A examples because I believe some of them might be in the chat or in the Q&A, sorry. Okay. Thank you, Natalie. So we'll just give everyone a second to join us. Again, don't use your real name unless you would like it displayed on the screen. Again, this is being recorded. So you can use your initials, you can use your favorite color, you can use your favorite animal, your favorite singer, musician, whoever. Awesome, love Simba. Thank you. So we'll wait for a few more folks to join. You don't have to join, but it definitely is encouraged to join. And we're just going to be doing a quiz and with some friendly competition to see how much we've learned or absorbed this session and help clarify any confusion. And so if anyone else wants to join, we'll just give you a few seconds. And if you're having any issues, please let us know in the chat or Q&A. But yes, you can join. If you're on a computer, just open a new tab. Don't close Zoom, but just open a new computer, internet browser tab, and you can click the link to go directly to it. Or use a mobile device to scan the QR code, or join us at slido.com with your phone or tablet. If anyone else wants to join, I'll give you a second. This workshop is scheduled until 12, so we would like to spend some time doing this quiz to review, and then we will answer the Q&A and have a discussion, and then you're all free to go and do the certificate or the feedback form to get a certificate as well. So Natalie, do you think we want to start now with our participants, or should we wait and see if the other folks want to join us?
Maybe just give everyone one more minute to join and get their answers in, and then we can go. Oh, we've had a few more people join, so yeah, just like a minute or so to give them time to answer.
All right, I think everyone's here. Or, well, yeah, this looks good. Okay, let's get started.
Okay.
And this is time, so you'll have 20 seconds to answer the question. No pressure. All right. So what are 3 ways boundaries are defined? Firm, permeable, malleable, adaptable, rigid or soft, rigid, permeable, flexible, soft, hard, or firm. Absolutely, yes. Thank you. The boundaries are defined in rigid, permeable, or flexible. So it's good to see that we remembered that. And if anyone has any questions about what that means, please throw them in the chat, and we'll be doing some scenarios as well. So next. Which one of the following is not a type of boundary? So all of these are boundary types except for one. Which one is not a boundary type that we discussed anyways?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. The correct answer is visual. And I mean, we might have visual boundaries in the sense that we don't want to look at horror movies, but essentially that's a I guess I would say an emotional boundary. We don't want to be emotionally scarred for life by watching a horror movie.
Yeah.
But yeah, so awesome. Good, good. Who's in the lead now? So we got CH in the lead. Apparently time matters as to who's the quickest to answer as well.
Mhm.
Next we have, what are the 4 communication styles that we talked about? Active, interpretive, assertive, passive, aggressive, affectionate, passive, passive, aggressive, passive, passive, aggressive, aggressive, assertive, loving, expressive, intimate, or cold. I feel like we're like at an option.
We had fun coming up with these.
Didn't think about having to read them all out. So that's awesome. Again, everyone got it right with passive, passive, aggressive, aggressive, and assertive. Thank you. And again, we might switch between all of these or any of these, and we might notice people flipping between these as well. And it's not that we want to call folks out on these if you're like, hey, you're being really passive aggressive, but in noticing that, we might be able to better navigate a conversation or a relationship or a connection, knowing these styles, right? And reflecting on ourselves on how we can better communicate with others. So looking at the leaderboard, oh, AKV has definitely gone up and CH has moved down to the second. I'm rooting for Simba just because I love that name.
Yeah.
All right, what are 2 types of boundaries violations? Inside and outside, internal, external, extraterrestrial, intergalactic, introverted, and extroverted.
It's good.
Yeah.
100% of people said internal and external, and that is good. Oh, CH back at the top.
All right, now we're moving into some scenarios. So your boss calls you outside of your agreed upon work time. You don't usually like to answer the phone after 6, but you make an exception. What boundary is this? Is it rigid, permeable, or flexible? Apology, should have added more time to that question.
Yeah.
We got, okay, yeah, so time is definitely the boundary that's being pushed right now. This is the type of boundary that is being pushed or challenged. And
Yes.
we've got mixed answers as to whether we think it's flexible or permeable. The correct answer is flexible. Natalie, do you want to explain why?
It's flexible because usually you wouldn't answer your phone to your boss, or maybe it's your work phone, so you just wouldn't answer it after a certain time. But because it's a different situation, your boss doesn't usually call you, you're willing to be flexible this time because it may be an emergency. If your boss always had a habit of calling you after 6 p.m. and this is why you have this boundary, it might be a bit of a different story. But I think it's flexible this time because it's an unusual situation.
Permeable would look like if you always answered your phone after 6 p.m. no matter what, your boss calls, you answer it. You don't really have a time boundary there with like work and time. It's also just like a boundary, like I guess emotionally, like you don't have that emotional boundary with like work and personal after work, which is fine. Not everyone has these boundaries, but that's just an example of how the boundary would be permeable in that circumstance. So on the leaderboard, we've got AKV moving on up. So we do have a few more scenarios. So I apologize. It's going to be a little, race to the finish to get your answer in there. But again, it's all in good fun. So you're dating someone new and you both would like to make your relationship sexual. However, you have told them you will not be sexual until you both complete and receive STI testing and results. What kind of boundary is this? And is it flexible, permeable, or rigid?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Okay, we've got almost everyone saying, almost everyone saying sexual and rigid, and then we've got a physical and rigid. So
yes, definitely it is sexual and rigid, although, like saying physical and rigid isn't too far off. It, could be within the realm, but I think that this is definitely it is sexual and rigid. And sometimes we need to have rigid boundaries. This is something that can impact your health. And so it's okay to have a rigid boundary around something that could impact your health. And
depending what your values are, right?
Yeah.
Like it all depends what your value. For some people, this isn't a rigid boundary. For some folks, it is. Similarly to the Love is Blind example, someone that Natalie used earlier, someone had a rigid boundary about marrying someone within their religion. They weren't willing to be flexible on it, depending on the religion or person. And they also weren't like, hey, yes, anyone. And so again, with sexual rigid boundaries, that's what we're seeing now. Your boundary that because it's specifically, STI testing and like sexual health, we're considering this a sexual boundary that is rigid. Before you even talk about I guess physical boundaries in space of like closeness, but again, we try to keep them separate.
Yeah. So, long story short, yeah. So Simba, wow, at the top, way to go. Always rooting for Simba. So, the next example is you hear your sibling crying in the bathroom. You ask if they can come in to support them, and they say, no, not now. Come back in 30 minutes. What kind of boundary are they not setting?
Sorry about that, folks. So we've got some conflicted answers. I think the question might have been a little confusing. So yeah, what kind of boundary is not being set in this situation? We're going with material. Natalie, do you want to elaborate?
So with this situation, they are setting a time boundary. They're saying not right now, come back in 30 minutes. And they're also setting an emotional boundary because they're kind of saying like right now, I just want time to myself. I'm feeling emotionally maybe a bit sensitive. I can't really receive anything right now. I'm not willing to accept support. So it's definitely like time, emotional, and maybe even a little physical boundaries, because then you have to physically go into their space. So the only boundary that doesn't really make sense in this situation would be material, because it doesn't really have a lot to do with with the situation.
Like material object, I guess, being the door, I suppose, but I guess we're talking about physical proximity. And again, these are just scenarios. They're very vague. There's a lot of inference and context and all that stuff. They're just to get your mind thinking. So it looks like Simba remains the winner. Congratulations, Simba. Thank you for your participation, everyone. And with that, we will finish the quiz, the tail end of the presentation.
So I'm actually putting something in the chat. This is a relationship mapping activity that we don't really have time for in this presentation, but you can download it right from the chat if it's something that you want to complete on your own time. And it just is something that can hopefully help you assess the boundaries and connections you have with people in your life.
Thank you, Natalie. And this relationship mapping activity or creating your own orbit activity is created by Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights. It is in there. I actually have it right here. It's in there, Beyond the Basics, a resource for educators on sexuality and sexual health. And we have it here and utilize and reference it a lot throughout our presentations. And so this activity is included. We've adapted it just for the presentation and attachment wise, but definitely check them out for more information. And like Natalie said, this relationship mapping activity will help you map out how close or like how strong or weak you have connections with different people, and how maybe you want to assess as to who you want to bring closer or distance yourself from, and then utilizing some of these communication skills and recognizing some of these boundaries you have and how permeable, flexible, or rigid they may or may not be. We're hoping this activity will just get you kind of thinking. And if you're in a spot right now that you're looking to assess boundaries, connections, and all of that fun stuff, this is the activity for you. So moving on, these are resources that we've utilized throughout this session and the series as well. You'll see Faith G. Harper's website is in the top right. If you ask for the slides from Natalie, there will be a PDF copy where you can click all the resources and information throughout the workshop and on this resource slide. So you can contact Natalie if you're looking for that. And again, we like to end things with a grounding question. I'll launch it in the Slido. If you're still in there, you can answer how you've taken care of yourself this past week. Again, no pressure if you don't want to participate or you're not able to. But if you want to throw it in there, how you've taken care of yourself this week, it doesn't have to be anything elaborate. It can be, I like to talk about boring self-care. So even if you showered this week, what day is it? Is it Tuesday? Yeah, if you've already showered this week, congratulations. Because sometimes I shouldn't be saying this is being recorded, but I don't shower till Thursday. You know, sometimes we just get so busy and we need to learn how to prioritize ourselves and take care of ourselves, especially with this long weekend coming up. So definitely take care of yourself. And I see some answers in the chat. They had their hair colored. Awesome. Yes, that is an ultimate form of like caring for yourself. I feel like, especially with the pandemic and the way things are going, getting your hair done is a form of caring for yourself. Making yourself a cup of tea, going for a walk, or taking your medication, anything like that are forms of self-care. Someone said they went to counseling today. That's awesome. Yeah, that's a huge form of self-care. Holy cow. Kudos to you. That's awesome. And so feel free to keep adding to the Slido if you would like to add in anything else or in the chat. And Natalie, do you want to wrap it up with the certificate information and contact info? Is that you?
Yeah, so we do have an evaluation survey that we are going to put in the chat. Oh, someone said that they showered for the first time in a week, had their counseling session. Work is hard, but worth it. And honestly, I feel that. Like that was probably also me last week. Like I'm glad we're honest about like where self-care is at, because that is caring for yourself.
Ultimate form. So especially during, if you're working from home. So Natalie's included the evaluation survey. I just wanted to note that if you need to go, feel free to click the survey link and head out. However, we would like to chat about the Q&A and some of the questions that I've seen thrown in there. And so to start, I see Natalie already answered one, but I just want to read them out for folks who are not able to see the questions. So someone asked, not being able to cook for my roommate all the time because of financials, would that be a material boundary? So Natalie responds saying, yes, this is absolutely would, and it would also be a time boundary. And so we go like financial boundaries kind of go into what material. And so anything, you know, because you can't do something because of financials, it may also be a material boundary. So maybe even financials, you don't have enough money to get food to be able to provide dinner for 2 people, right? Like that's a lot of work. So having that boundary and being able to communicate that may be helpful in that situation. So thank you, Natalie, for answering that. And again, if anyone has anything to add or comment or contribute, please feel free to use the Slido or the chat or Q&A. Someone else mentioned having a hard time saying no to plans, like even when you don't really want to. Where would this one be defined? Is it a time boundary? Yes, so your senses are correct. You're feeling a time boundary, like you want to spend time with yourself, which is totally fine, I'm assuming, or your cat or your dog or your partner or whatever. You want to spend time not with whoever's asking you to go on plans, and you don't really want to. So your value there is that you value your time outside of those plans, and so which is obviously okay, and we're all entitled to that. And so having that time boundary as to who you want to spend your time with, whether it's yourself or others, where you want to spend that time and how. And it can also be, I'm trying to think, it could be a financial boundary, like maybe you don't even want to go, or like a material boundary, sorry, you don't want to go because you have other plans going on, or you're committed to your pajamas and Netflix on the couch, like it's up to you. Natalie, do you have anything you want to add to that one, or or add to the next one?
Yes, so this used to be me. I used to have a hard time saying no when I didn't want to go out. I'm actually quite introverted, but I, didn't ever feel like I could say no. I didn't know that that was even an option. And so without me even knowing it, it was a permeable boundary to going out. It was definitely a time boundary, but it also in a lot of ways was an emotional boundary because an intellectual, it really like was draining on my energy. And so
could be spiritual, like, so it depends what your values are. So what you just said about like draining your energy could be a spiritual boundary. It could be like the hanging out. For some reason I always think like going to the movies, but if you're hanging out to have a conversation about political party platforms and the state of the world, maybe that's a really intellectual, emotionally draining conversation you do not want to be a part of.
Exactly.
So there's different boundaries that come into play depending on the situation, and recognizing that that boundary might be permeable if you're always saying yes to hanging out when you don't want to, versus the boundary being flexible where you say no, when you don't actually want to, and you say yes when you do want to, or when it is feasible for you to go. Sorry, I was just going to say the last attendee comment is someone says, so saying snarky comments to someone would be passive aggressive, ? And the short answer is yes, as we mentioned before, in the context that the snarky comment is not alluding to what they actually want to say, so, thanks for finally vacuuming. Like, it's all about how you say it. If you actually genuinely say, hey, thanks for vacuuming, I really appreciate it, like that's different than saying, oh, thanks for vacuuming finally. That's more passive aggressive in the tone of voice and conversation, and that the action, the words and the actions aren't lining up. Like my words and my tone of voice are not matching up, and that's a really great way to assess if something's passive aggressive. For example, thanks for finally doing the groceries, smiley face, ... like, or something, something that's, not being completely honest with yourself or the other person as to like your intentions of that comment. So an example of a snarky comment that like wouldn't be passive aggressive would be just like something, it could even be an assertive snarky comment, just saying, you look like garbage today. That's an assertive snarky comment that I hope no one is saying. Natalie, you don't look like garbage.
Thank you.
I was trying to think of something off the top of my head. And so again, being able to recognize that these communication styles can fluctuate depending on the context, the way things are said. Natalie, do you want to expand on that?
So I think that passive aggressive comments or snarky comments, like there's two different kinds. There's the kind that Kylee mentioned, thanks for finally vacuuming. Thanks for, getting the groceries. It'd really be nice if somebody would clean the coffee pot. Behind these maybe like needs that people don't know how to express. Their boundaries people may not know how to express. And, then there's snarky comments that are, depending on your relationship with somebody, it may be just jokes, right? Like, but I think it's just when I'm talking to somebody who is being passive aggressive and I'm trying to be more assertive, the thing I always ask myself is, what need is trying to be met here? And sometimes I'll actually ask that to the person. I'll say, is there something that you need from me right now? Or, is this something that you would like me to do? Because behind that is usually somebody that has a need, is trying to assert a boundary, but they're just not really sure how to do that. And they're feeling really frustrated. And so, like that doesn't excuse somebody being passive aggressive, but it's sort of like, if you can step back in that moment and say like, they're trying to meet a need right now. Or if you're being passive aggressive and you're like, I'm trying to get a need met, I'm just not sure how to do it. That kind of like borders into relationships, but just next week.
Yeah, I was going to say that's next week. And we also have the activity for relationship mapping to kind of identify that as well. But yeah, essentially, Natalie summed it up perfectly. I don't have anything to add unless anyone else has any comments or questions. And again, you can contact Natalie for the slides. Her email is in the chat. Please fill out our evaluation survey. It's anonymous and you get a certificate of attendance. And if you haven't done so already, register to join us next week, April 19th for relationships. The recording for this session and all of the other sessions will be available on our YouTube channel. later this week. So again, feel free to check that out as well. Anything else to add before we bid adieu?
Someone said in the Slido word cloud that something they did to take care of themselves this past week was take this workshop. And that's really, thank you.
I love that. Thank you. That makes me happy today. And yeah, Natalie, what are you doing today or this week that takes care of yourself, to take care of yourself?
I'm just making sure that I, go to bed at the right time and eat enough things and drink enough water. So
Yeah,
that's sort of how I try to maintain caring for myself.
Yeah, I think today for me, it's the sunshine. I'm gonna go and soak up some sun. That's how I'm gonna take care of myself today. And with that, I will turn my mic and camera off, just to give you all some space to think and reflect. Please reach out if you need any support or have questions. We're gonna hang around for a couple minutes, probably until 11:30, to assist anyone if you have any questions. But with that being said, you're more than welcome to enjoy the rest of your morning. These workshops typically, will end a little bit early depending on discussion and Q&A. We just like to leave lots of time for that opportunity and to hook people up with supports and resources if you have any questions or anything like that.